Hi everyone. This recording is really around the marking criteria for your project report. So as previously discussed, it's a 55% assignment, so I'm providing you with as much information as I possibly can. If you have any questions regarding this marking criteria, please let me know in classes and so on, and I will clarify anything. I can always jump on here and update and clarify things throughout the semester if you're unsure of anything. So please let me know, and I'm happy to make any changes to make sure it's clear. So part A, this is what you're handing in pairs. So as I've sort of discussed in other videos, try to probably up until week 3, do your own work, and then in week 4, combine with a pair of your choice and combine the two, reach consensus on what you think belongs where, and submit that. So as you can see over here, it's 2 pages maximum. I want you to use headings in this section so I know what you're talking about, and detail what is to be included in each heading. So I personally would use, you could probably ignore the executive summary, but you've got the introduction, aims and objectives, methodology, results, etc. I would use those headings as part of your report overview so that what you're providing me reflects the project report that you'll be submitting at the end, and I'm giving you feedback based on that. So that is how to address this section. Please include any standards that are required. So there are blindingly obvious standards that you can refer to. Make sure they are in this document and you refer to them so that I know that you're analysing your menu, etc., against something, and it's not just you're thinking it's going to be your own opinion. So you need to be comparing against set standards. So in terms of marking for this section, the more information you can give me, the better. You can just use dot points, but the more information you have, the more meaningful feedback I can give you. The less information you have, I can't give you feedback. I can only give you feedback on what you provide. So the more information, the better. If you provide me with an overview where each section is thorough and contains pretty accurate information for future content, and you've included the different standards and so on, and discuss what you'll be analysing the diet against, or the menu against, you'll get a 5 out of 5. So it's not really that difficult to get 5 out of 5 for this particular section. If most sections are clearly detailed, roughly provides an accurate overview, then and the standards are referenced correctly, then you'll get 4 out of 5. So there may be things, to get 4 out of 5 instead of a 5 out of 5, you might have things that, belong in the results, but you've included them in the methodology, or maybe you are giving the results in the discussion and in the results section when the discussion shouldn't be reporting on the results. The discussion should be reporting on what the results mean. So that's how you might end up with a 4 instead of a 5 out of 5. But if you give me plenty of information and it's roughly correct, you can almost guarantee yourself a 4 or a 5 out of 5. So a 3 out of 5, you've got the different sections labelled, so the intro, methods, etc. There's a fair few things incorrect. I have to provide you with a fair bit of information in terms of where things go and where things don't, and maybe you're missing some content. Look, I expect you to be missing some content, but sort of missing content that should be included at this point in time in the semester. And then sort of you might have referenced one standard rather than what I'm expecting you to have referenced. Those standards will be discussed in workshops and so on. So you should know what you're referencing. So 2 out of 5, so it's sort of incomplete. You haven't put in that much work, I suppose, into it. It's mostly accurate, but it's not a very good overview, and it's lacking detail. And a 2 really impacts my ability to provide you with feedback, because there's not enough information in there for me to actually be able to go, oh, do this, do that, do that, do that. It's more like I don't even know sort of what your thought processes are yet for me to be able to put you on the right path. I don't know. So you're probably getting a 2 if that's the case. So very low is 0 to 1. 0 is you pretty much haven't submitted anything. Or it might be that you've submitted and you've put the headings and that's maybe one dot point under each, and that's about it. A 1 out of 5, maybe you've referenced completely inaccurate standards, incorrect information, lacking detail, and so on. So that's part A for you. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how to get good marks. If you get a 0, a 1, or a 2, you need to come and see me in a lecture or a workshop or whatever, so I can go through that information with you and provide you with some kind of guidance. And I'm not saying that it would be guidance other students aren't going to get in lectures and so on, but maybe we need to have a discussion about where to find information, where to go to, and how you would have done better. Yeah, so please come and see me if you get at the lower end of that. Or if you feel like I haven't given you enough feedback, please come in and see me as well, because I'm always happy to give you feedback if it helps you get a better mark in the longer term. Okay, so then we get to part B. So part B is worth 45%, and you'll see over in this sort of darker blue column here, executive summary, and that's 2 pages maximum. Now, I would leave your executive summary to last. This should be the last thing that you write, because it's a summary of everything else, and it's short and sweet. So it's 2 pages to cover the other 16 pages, or to summarise the other 16 pages. So you should use subheadings, and you'll have a bit of a review of the food service system, so an outline of what's happened, what's going on, why is this food service system being reviewed. You'll have your method of analysis detailing the standards that you're comparing the menu against, and what maybe the reasons are behind that. So the results of that analysis you'll report on as well. You'll discuss the requirements of the new system. So that's a bit of a quick summary of the discussion from the main project report. And then you'll detail the recommendations. So that's really important to have in the executive summary, so that the executive that is reading this summary has a good idea of what you think needs to happen, so then they can read the project report and get your justification for those things. So to get 5 out of 5 for the executive summary, so it's complete, coherent, succinct executive summary with all sections professionally written. So by professionally written, there's no errors, there's no, like, as I said, finishing a sentence halfway through a sentence and not actually completing it. Grammatically, it's good, spelling is good, sentence structure is good. It aligns with the rest of the project report, so you can't be bringing in new ideas into the executive summary that you haven't addressed in the body of the project report. So essentially I mark everything else and then come back to this executive summary and make sure that this executive summary reflects the rest of the project report. So that's my order for marking. So I suggest you do the same. Do this last so that it's an accurate reflection of the rest of the project report. And here, detailed summary of the major recommendations with no missing details. So you might have a whole bunch of recommendations, but the major ones that need to happen need to be detailed in the executive summary. If you only detail 1 or 2 recommendations, you can guarantee you're not going to get 5 out of 5. So you need to make sure that you are detailing all of the major recommendations in the executive summary. The minor recommendations that you might make, you can probably leave off, but you need to critically think about what ones go in and what ones do not go into the executive summary. and you need to stick to that 2 pages maximum for an executive summary, and that'll be double spaced because you'll be following the Griffith Health formatting guidelines. So 4 out of 5, like it's well written. There may be lacking some professionalism. It's complete, it's coherent. It still is a good summary of the rest of the project report. It's just not sort of perfect. It has a good summary of the major recommendations, but you might be missing something that I sort of look at and go, well, that's really important for an executive to know. So you're probably missing a recommendation or something that I would have included, and maybe it's not as professionally written compared to a 5 out of 5. So 3 out of 5 is you're lacking some kind of coherence, or it's not succinct. Maybe you've rambled too much in a particular section, which has meant that maybe your recommendations are shorter than what they should be because you've spent too much time, reviewing the current food service system. So you need to make sure that the information, I guess, is spread so that you're putting the correct emphasis on the correct areas. It's a sound summary of the major recommendations, but again, you've got a couple missing, and you might have some minor errors throughout. Maybe some detail that was actually really important is missing, or perhaps you've included information in the executive summary which actually isn't discussed anywhere else in the project report. So 2 out of 5 of it, maybe it's not complete. So maybe you don't have all of those subheadings there. Maybe you do, but it's just too brief and really doesn't give an executive a clear idea of what on earth you've done. The summary of the recommendations is incomplete. Maybe there's 3 of the major details missing, and you've got errors throughout. So that could be, when I refer to errors down here, that could be spelling errors, grammatical errors, inclusion of information that's not elsewhere, the exclusion of information that was really important that should go into an executive summary, and so on. And then 0 or 1 is, the only time I've given a 0 for an executive summary is basically they didn't do it. Usually you get at least 1. So have all your headings. Recommendations might be extremely brief. You might only include 1 or 2 recommendations because you're running out of space. Maybe your executive summary goes over 3 pages and all of your recommendations are on the 3rd page, and I don't look then at the 3rd page because you've gone over the limit. So you would get incomplete recommendations, poorly summarised, and that would bring your mark down quite substantially just because you've gone over the page limit. So be really careful about that page limit. This column here I used to be able to provide you guys with feedback. So like I'll detail, what you've missed, that kind of thing as a feedback mechanism for you. Okay, so then we have the introduction. So within the introduction, you should be reviewing the current food service system. So that's giving me the information you've got on the rehab facility. Within that, you might talk about Townsville, where it's located, what the population is, etc. You'll give me the background of the old residents as well as the incoming residents. You'll review, the nutritional requirements of the incoming residents, and you'll be very clear about what you need to meet and what you don't need to meet in terms of therapeutic diet requirements and so on. You might talk about other requirements of the residents. So as I said, they're an ageing population. You have 30% First Australians attending this facility. So you need to talk about that and what might be required as a result of having those residents there. You might want to talk about, the impact of the location. So 2019 brought some devastating floods to the area. Now that was immediately after some devastating drought. So you had major issues going on in that area, which is not uncommon. Cyclones go through Townsville all the time. Drought is around all the time. So you need to discuss what sort of impact the location has. So, food availability and so on. during a flood, what happens, where do people get their food from, emergency procedures and so on. So I know it's just one dot point there, like summarise the impact of the location of the food service system, but actually it's fairly important because you need to think about how those things are going to impact your facility. So out of 5, and I'm going to go through this a little bit quicker because I realise you could be getting quite bored listening to me. So 5, again, lots of detail. You've been clear, you've been concise, you've detailed the food service system, you've given a good background of the residents and discussed all the unique requirements of the residents. You've discussed the impact of the location. So that's a whole section of its own here in your marking criteria. So really important not to miss that component out, because the way I basically mark this is I might go, yep, clear and concise, you've given great background, you've talked about the requirements, you have not discussed the location. And so if you just added in like a decent paragraph on the location, you would have gotten 5, but as a result you might get 3.5 out of 5 instead of 5, simply because you haven't, this has pulled your mark down quite considerably. So please think about that when you are writing it, and that's why I want you looking at the marking criteria as you do your project report, because it's really important for my marking that you meet all of these things. And then basically it goes down. So yep, you've explained the system, but maybe not in the detail that you could have. You've given background information, maybe not enough, but still very good, just not sort of in the detail that I would like. Requirements of the residents is clear and mostly complete. So you might talk about like the therapeutic diet requirements, but you might have forgotten to mention that there's no allergies. So that would put you in a 4, whereas to get a 5, you would have said, these are the therapeutic diet requirements, there are no allergies, etc. So all of that would have been summarised perfectly, but here you might be missing something. And again, there's that impact on location. 3, you explain the food service system, but you might have errors, or there might be lack of clarity of thought as to what happens when. The background of the residents is discussed. You'll have some peer-reviewed literature, etc. in there, but you are going to be missing some detail. You've talked about the requirements. Again, you might talk about the therapeutic diet requirements, but you might get it slightly wrong. You've probably missed some information. Again, I'll use our allergies. You might have missed the allergy information. It's just not quite right. But again, you've discussed that impact of the location, not to the extent of 4 or 5 out of 5, but you've discussed it. 2, you're making quite a few errors around what you think was happening. Your background is incomplete. You haven't sort of discussed the background of the incoming residents. You might have not referred to much literature. The requirements is incomplete, so you might have talked about allergies but not the therapeutic diet requirements. You might have referred to location being an issue, but that's sort of the extent of it. And then 0 or 1 is, you really haven't covered the information appropriately. So hopefully you won't get a 0 or a 1. Hopefully you'll get, at least a 3 for that particular section. Okay, so moving into aims and objectives. So it's a 1-page limit for aims and objectives. The overall aim of the food service system to be delivered to the new residents. So we will have a workshop on writing aims and objectives, so please make sure you attend, because I will cover that information in detail. The objectives need to be SMART objectives, and they should deliver the aim. So there should be nothing in the aim that's not covered in the objectives, and you shouldn't have objectives that don't directly refer to whatever your aim is. So really important that they all link in together, and that reflects the rest of your project report. So if you've got all that, then you'll get a 5 out of 5. So timing must be appropriate and realistic. You've no idea how many times people write their objectives and they forget to put any reference to time and when things are due by. Now, you are making it up. Now, you know that the building must be built by May 2020, so you need to tell me when you think things should be due. When do you think the menu review needs to be done by, etc. So 4, it's clear. Objectives support the overall aim. It might not be perfect. It might not quite encompass all aspects of the project report, but you've done a really good job if you get 4 out of 5. For 3, it encompasses most aspects of the project report, but definitely not all of it. The objectives are well written, but there might be, one that's not written in the SMART format. You've got timing there, generally realistic, but maybe there's something off about it. So sometimes you might get a 3 here if everything is due at once, which isn't realistic. Things are staggered. So think about your timing, and you're going to have some errors and omissions happening to get 3 out of 5. And you're just going down from then. So here, your timing is vague, more errors and omissions, it's sort of incomplete, your objectives aren't SMART, they don't really match the aim, and then it just gets worse for 0 or 1. So you might have objectives that are completely unrelated to the aim, they might not be SMART, you might have multiple aims and one objective. Anything can happen for you to end up with a 0, but as I said, we have a workshop on aims and objectives, so hopefully you'll do fine in that section. So methodology, so you got a 3-page maximum. So in here you're talking about how you're going to go about analysing the menu. You're going to have to make some assumptions. So you're going to have, people have a choice of what they can eat. They're not going to eat 100% of everything. So you need to make some reasonable assumptions around consumption of your patients. And you need to compare the menu against appropriate standards. So if in your methodology you tell me that you're going to compare the menu to a standard that is required at a acute hospital, well, that is incorrect. This is not an acute hospital, this is a residential aged care facility. So you need to be comparing the menu against the correct standard. So that sort of thing is included in the methodology. So to get 5 out of 5, your assumptions are reasonable and they're explicitly identified and clearly described. So you may all have slightly different assumptions, and that is okay, that is fine. It's the test of reason. Is it a reasonable assumption for you to make? If the answer is yes, then you can get a 5 out of 5, okay? They need to be specifically identified. So if you've made assumptions that I can see written in your results section, which aren't described in the methodology, then that's when you're going to start losing marks through here. So your assumptions need to be explicit, they need to be clear, and they need to be reasonable. Your method of analysing the menu is also clear and replicable. So you could give this to your mother or father or brother or sister. They could follow your instructions and they could analyse the menu in exactly the same way you have. So a lay person can follow your instructions and do it exactly the same way. Okay, so if you're missing information and I have to make an assumption of how you've come up with that information, then you're not going to get 5 out of 5. This can be dot points. You can go step 1, do this. Step 2, do this. That's fine, but I need to be able to copy exactly what you've done. If I have to make a single assumption, you're down into the 4 category. So your method of analysis might be clearly described and it's mostly replicable. So I might be able to do everything except for one thing. But again, your assumptions are reasonable, identified, and they're clearly described. 3, reasonable assumptions, mostly clear. You might be a little bit vague, not 100% sort of clear or well described. Most parts of the analysis in terms of the step-by-step process are replicable, but not all of it, and I'm going to have to make assumptions on what you did or how you did it. So there's errors starting to creep in here, most definitely. For 2, your assumptions, either you haven't listed them or they're incomplete or they're not reasonable. Like you've made an assumption that they're going to eat both hot meals at every single, meal time, and they're going to consume 100%, of that's not a reasonable assumption. So you need to make, clear assumptions that are reasonable. But could be well written, but just not reasonable. Your method of analysis is a bit vague. I can't really follow it. I have to interpret things in my own way, which will mean that my analysis would end up being different to your analysis. And so you've got errors throughout here. And then 0 or 1, your assumptions are incomplete, or they're completely unreasonable, or they're really poorly written and I can't follow what you're sort of writing. The method of analysis is incomplete. You might have used, again, completely incorrect things to compare it against. I can't replicate your analysis. And so there's major errors starting to creep in to get 0 or 1 out of 5. Results, again, we've got a 3-page maximum. So this is just the results of the menu analysis. So you'll have maybe tables and graphs in this particular section. It aligns with the methodology. So you're not reporting anything in results that you haven't covered in the methodology. It all must align perfectly. And you don't make any recommendations here. You are merely giving the results of the analysis. That is all you are doing, okay? So 5 out of 5, it's well written, it's complete, it's succinct, and aligns with the methods. Again, you can add tables, graphs, whatever helps the reader to interpret what the results were. 4 is, it's well written, it aligns with the methods, could have been better. Maybe it's all writing and you haven't used a single table or graph to help provide a better results compared to something that's 5 out of 5. So, I mean, it should, if you want 5 out of 5, it should be a nice combination of tables and graphs and written. Now, you also, having said that, shouldn't all be tables or graphs with no written interpretation of what that table or graph means. So the table or graph adds value, but it's not the only thing that's there. You need to have writing that goes with the table or the graph, okay? 3 out of 5, the results align with the methods. Mostly well written. You've got a few errors. Maybe it's not 100% in alignment. Maybe I'm reading it and I'm like, that's impossible for that to be the result based on the method that you've given me, and I don't understand how you got there. So that might be one section, and so that would be a minor error. If that was in several sections where it just didn't quite match up, then you're probably looking at 2 out of 5. Maybe the results are confusing. Maybe it's hard to read and I don't understand what you're talking about. And then 1, results are incomplete. They don't necessarily align with the methods that you've provided. There's some major errors throughout. Okay. Discussion. So this is where people get quite confused. This is not repeating the results. This is different. This is reporting on the impact the results will have. What do the results actually mean? I don't need you to retell me how many kilojoules or grams of protein or something are in there, but you might do a quick summary and say, the inadequate protein provided in the menu, means this will happen. But you don't need to re-report the results here. So that is my first dot point there. Do not repeat the results. You might need to rediscuss, any standards, etc. You might need to talk about the unique requirements of the residents. Now that might be around, you've got some First Australians there. So what unique requirements do they have? Something that we can do within a food service that helps to respect their culture. So this might be somewhere where you can bring in, things that are beyond just a menu analysis, and more about providing a food service system that holistically meets the needs of all of our residents. You know, we know that disasters happen in Townsville. We know the cyclones, the floodings, the droughts, everything that happens. So you want to talk about disaster management. You know, do we need to prepare for, you know, what disasters might occur in the area? Now, you're not going to recommend a disaster management plan here, but you will talk about, you know, events that have occurred in recent years in Townsville, and that, you know, that has an impact on food service ability. Because then in your recommendations, you will then talk about a disaster management plan and recommend that. So this isn't a recommendation. This is just you talking about the topic. So when you make the recommendation, it links to something within the discussion. Discuss any limitations likely to be encountered by the new facility. So, you know, I put that in. You might not be able to come up with any. There might be some that are really clear for you on limitations that are at that facility. This is your opportunity to discuss. It might be issues with staffing or training or, you know, age of staff or, you know, whatever it might be. You can include it here in the discussion. So if you have a complete, coherent and succinct discussion and all aspects are really high quality, you've got a broad discussion considering all aspects of the issues that this population might be facing, or, you know, impacts on health, etc., and you do not include any recommendations, then you'll get 5 out of 5. If you do this really well, but then you include a recommendation, you might end up with a 4 overall, so you may inadvertently include a recommendation, so that will maybe bring that down to a 4 or a 4.5 if you accidentally put a recommendation in there as well. Complete and coherent discussion, you know, all high quality, broad discussion considering issues likely to impact on the health, maybe not as broad as here, maybe not as inclusive as all the different things that you can include, but certainly a good discussion. And again, you don't include recommendations. So that will give you a 4 out of 5. So 3 out of 5 is, you know, discussion's coherent, it's a good quality, it's not great, but it's good, you know. You're going to have some really obvious things missing from your discussion. It might be that, you know, you've given results around some of your analysis, but then you haven't discussed what that means. So that would be an omission if you haven't discussed what the impact of the result has on the population. And again, you might be sneaking in some, you know, recommendation accidentally. It's really easy to do that, so I highly recommend you go back through and make sure you haven't made any recommendations in this section. For 2, you know, it's incomplete. You haven't discussed the impact of the results. There might be major things that you're missing in terms of like the first Australians or maybe the age of the population coming in. You've missed something, you know, important. And you've almost certainly got, you know, recommendations included in this section. And then 0 or 1, you know, it's incomplete. You haven't covered everything. There's major things missing, major omissions, and there's confusion is evident between what is a discussion versus what are recommendations. Or, you know, it might be in here that you're reporting on the results again, and so on. So if you're reporting on results, that will bring your mark down. But if you're reporting on the impact of results, that's fine. That's what goes into the discussion. That then leads us to the recommendations. So, you know, again, 3 pages maximum here. So the recommendations needs to be developed from the intro, the results and the discussion. So the recommendations can't come out of nowhere. You have to have discussed it in some context somewhere else. If all of a sudden you're recommending something and there's no justification for that recommendation in your project report, you need to go back and put a justification in somewhere else. So you might have to go back to the discussion and realise that you've forgotten to talk about a certain component. Go back in, put in a paragraph, and then that will make, you know, that succinct. implementation is considered. So how are you going to implement the food service system? So I can go into more detail on that in class, but that's, things like how do people order, where do people go, that kind of thing. All the different standards have been considered when you're writing your recommendations, and you meets the unique requirements of the incoming residents. So your recommendations should align with the clientele. So to get 5 out of 5, it's complete, coherent, succinct recommendations. Everything aligns, everything's been previously mentioned or discussed in some kind of way. There's no recommendation that suddenly jumps out that has never been commented on before. The implementation of the food service system has been considered and is detailed. So that's around how to, as I said before, how do people order, where do people go, what do people do, etc. It's not about building a facility or any, that's outside of your scope. It's about what is the functional things that are happening on the ground to get that food to the patient. 4 out of 5, complete and coherent, aligns with previous sections. Maybe it's not succinct, maybe it's not quite coherent, maybe it's a little bit hard to read, but it's pretty good generally. And implementation has been considered, but maybe not in as much detail as what it would be if it was a 5 out of 5. So 3 out of 5, so recommendations align, but there's some omissions, there's some missing detail somewhere, whether you've talked about something really clearly in the results and then you've made no recommendations around that, or maybe you've made a recommendation that has come out of nowhere. Implementation has been considered, but again, isn't quite as clearly written as 4 or 5 out of 5. You've got a couple of errors starting to sneak in here for 3 out of 5. 2 recommendations are made, incomplete, incoherent, doesn't necessarily align. Implementation has kind of been considered, but you might consider one aspect of implementation, but nothing else. And you've got errors and omissions throughout. And then, 1, everything is limited recommendations. They don't necessarily align. New things are popping up that have never been discussed. Implementation has been considered to a very limited extent, and you've got some major errors going on. So then we go to critical thinking. So critical thinking is a mark out of 5. And in previous years, this has been a must-pass component. I've taken that out for this year because this assignment is no longer a must-pass assignment. Critical thinking really makes sure that your whole project report makes sense. If there are things that don't make sense, or if there are things that don't align with other parts, that's when you're going to start losing marks. So if there's excellent critical reasoning and justifications throughout, you're consistent throughout all the different sections, then you'll get 5 out of 5. If it's pretty good, and you've got justifications throughout and your recommendations are solid, and you're pretty consistent, you'll get 4 out of 5. 3, you've got sound clinical reasoning and justification, but there are some sort of errors in, like I can sort of look at it and go, I can see why you've done it, but it's not quite logical. You've got some inconsistencies throughout the project report, things popping up in some places but not others. So that's when you're sort of getting 3 out of 5. 2 is poor clinical reasoning. So you've come up with stuff that it's not related to what you've been talking about. You've got inconsistencies throughout. So this will often happen if this happens when I find, well, what I think my theory is, you might be reading someone else's project report and giving them feedback on their project report, and you see something that you go like, oh, that's a really good idea. So then you put it into your recommendations, but then you haven't actually gone and thought about, it doesn't actually relate to your project report. You like the idea, but you haven't actually embedded it anywhere else. So that I think that's when people start getting 2 out of 5, when they're getting ideas from other people, and not threading it through the project report appropriately. And 0 or 1 is, things don't make sense. It's hard to read. There's no consistency of thought. I don't understand why you've chosen some of the things that you've chosen. That's when you're going to start to get 0 or 1 out of 5. So, sorry, we're getting to the end. Written communication and references. So clear and sophisticated sentence structure, you'll get a 5. The paragraphs are well structured and sequenced well, and it all flows and is logical, you'll get a 5. Minimal spelling or grammatical errors. Like if there's a couple here and there, that's fine, because that's just going to happen, because you can read your work 10 times and not see that there's a word missing. That happens. So that's sort of fine. The report itself is, presented professionally. It meets all of the Griffith Uni assignment presentation formatting guidelines. So I've referred to that multiple times. I've put links on Learning at Griffith. If you meet all of those requirements, then you get 5 out of 5. If you don't meet all of those requirements, what that means is that I then have to apply that to your assignment so that the word length and all that kind of stuff is equal across everyone, and then I mark it. So if I have to make a single adjustment, you get 0 for that section. You either get 0 out of 5 for this component of this section, or 5 out of 5. It's a yes or a no. Did you follow them or did you not? If you got the wrong font or you got the wrong font size, then you're going to get 0 for this section. If you have followed it perfectly, then you'll get 5 out of 5. It's the easiest 5 out of 5 within that section that you can get. So please follow it. And then this goes on to, peer-reviewed literature and so on. So you've used sort of 10 plus peer-reviewed literature in order to get 5 out of 5 there. So 3 out of 5. So you've got acceptable sentence structure and expression. So it's not clear and sophisticated, but it is sort of fine. Paragraphs of sound structure and sequencing with no minor problems. So generally makes sense. You might have a couple of paragraphs that sort of I might swap around for the purpose of logic and development of your project, but generally it's pretty good. You've got several spelling and grammatical errors coming through here, which I would think that if you had gone back through and reread, you probably would have picked up on them. Sound presentation, so it's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And maybe 7 to 9 sources beyond the course readings of peer-reviewed literature. So you can still get a 4 because you'll just get a combination of these things in order to get yourself a 4 out of 5 for this section. So a 0 or a 1, this is when your assignment's hard to read, okay? Like the sentences are hard, they're not structured properly, the paragraphs are all over the place. It makes it really hard to mark your assignment. That's when you're going to get, your 0. Significant problems with structure, yep. Frequent spelling and grammatical errors. So this is clearly you have not reread your project report. You've probably done things at the last minute and just gone, I don't want to look at it ever again, and you've submitted it. You need to allocate like at least 3 or 4 days at the end of downtime where you're not looking at it. So before you submit it, you can have another look and make sure you pick up on any spelling and grammatical errors, or at least most of them. Presentation might be poor. 0 if there's even one component of the Griffith Health assignment presentation guidelines that you haven't met. And you're lacking, peer-reviewed literature and so on. Again, you can still get a 2. It's just you'll get a combination of these throughout. And then there's section C. So again, this is 5%. It's your self-assessment. I need to make sure, please, that you give yourself a final mark out of 45. So you might give yourself 40 out of 45. Perfect. Let's say you get 40 out of 45. And I've given you 41 out of 45. So you'd be within 2.5 plus or minus 2.5 marks. And let's say throughout you've given yourself, a 3 here, a 4 here, a 5 here, etc. If that is roughly what I've given you, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if it's kind of roughly what I've given you, then you'll get a 5 out of 5. If you've given yourself 40 out of 45 and I've given you 41 out of 45, and you've actually said that some sections you did excellently in, and other section, you know, there might be one section where you think you did really poorly, but in actual fact that wasn't the case at all, and you've clearly not really done a good job of reflecting on what sections you've done well and haven't, then you get a 4. But as long as you're within 2.5 marks, then you'll get a 4 or a 5 out of 5. Now remembering that's a 2.5 mark range, plus or minus, so that's 5 marks. So as long as you're full sort of in that 10%ish range, then you'll get 4 or 5 out of 5. 5 marks, so that's, you've got a 10 mark grace there, because it's plus or minus 5 marks around the mark that I've given you. And then I no longer am worried about whether, you know, you've been accurate as to what mark you've given yourself where. If you fall within 5 marks, then you'll get 3 out of 5 for this section. If it's within 7.5, then you get 2. If it's within 10, you get 0 or 1. So what this means is that you might go from being just under 50% overall for sections A and B to being above 50%, because you might have only just passed your assignment, but because you know and you've been able to accurately reflect that you've just passed, and you get within 2.5, you might end up with 5 out of 5 for this section, which will pick up your assignment grade by quite a bit. So don't underestimate the value of marking your own assignment against the marking criteria. In previous years, when the 55% assignment has been a must pass, there have been students who have failed, but because they accurately reflected that they had failed, and only by just a little bit, they actually end up getting 5 out of 5 for this section, which made them an overall pass for the entire assignment, which meant that they didn't have to resubmit and so on. Again, that's not happening this year. This year it's not a must pass assignment, but that's the kind of difference, you know, 5% can make. So there is a late penalty of 5% per business day. So I'm very, very strict. At 5 p.m. is the cutoff. If you submit at 5:01, you will get a 5% penalty per business day. So it's due on the Friday. So this is per business day. So Friday at 5:01, a 5% penalty applies. Saturday is not a business day. Sunday is not a business day. Monday is. So on Monday at 5 p.m, because that's one business day after the Friday at 5 p.m. So at 5:01 on Monday, it becomes 10%. At 5:01 on Tuesday, it becomes 15%. After 5 business days, you get a 0 out of 55. So that is how the late penalties work according to Griffith Uni assessment policy. And that brings us to the very end. So that was a very long talk about the marking criteria, but hopefully it's given you lots of detail. And again, any questions, please bring it along to the lecture or put it on a discussion board, and I'm happy to discuss. Thank you.